Have you ever wondered what it feels like when the person who's supposed to love you most looks at you like you're a mistake that needs to be erased? When your own blood decides you're worth nothing more than the coins in a stranger's pocket? Tonight, we dive into Luella's story, a girl whose father saw dollar signs where he should have seen his daughter's beating heart. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see how many hearts this story reaches across the world. And if you believe every soul deserves to be cherished, smash that like button and subscribe, because tomorrow we're bringing you another story that'll remind you why love should never come with a price tag. The morning Luella's life changed forever started with blood under her fingernails. She knelt beside her father Ezekiel's chair, her trembling fingers working to scrub the crimson stains from his knuckles while he counted dirty $20 bills with the other hand. Each bill crinkled between his tobacco-stained fingers like autumn leaves ready to crumble, and she could smell the copper tang of blood mixing with the stale whiskey that permanently clung to his breath. "Faster, girl," Ezekiel growled, not bothering to look down at her. His voice carried that familiar edge, the one that made her stomach twist into knots tighter than the rope he used to tie down cargo in his truck. "Can't have the buyers seeing me looking like I've been in a scrap." Luella's cloth moved quicker across his split knuckles, the warm water in her bowl turning pink like watered-down wine. She wanted to ask whose blood decorated her father's hands this time. But 20 years of living under Ezekiel's roof had taught her that curiosity earned bruises that took weeks to fade. The fight had happened 3 hours ago, right outside Morrison's tavern where the morning light was still too weak to chase away the shadows. She'd watched through their kitchen window as her father's fists connected with Jeremiah Thompson's face, all because Jeremiah had made the mistake of calling her Ezekiel's pretty daughter after too many drinks. But the rage in her father's eyes wasn't protective. It was shame, pure and burning, like he was trying to beat the lie right out of Jeremiah's mouth. "Pretty," Ezekiel had spat between punches. "You blind drunk fool, look at her. Look at that crooked nose, them thin lips, that scar cutting through her eyebrow. Pretty? She's damaged goods, and you're too stupid to see it." Each word had hit Luella harder than any fist ever could. Now, as she cleaned the evidence of his shame from his hands, the sound of iron wheels grinding against gravel drifted through their thin walls. A carriage was approaching, not the rickety farm wagons that usually visited their property, but something expensive, something that whispered of money and secrets. "He's here," Ezekiel muttered, pulling his hands away from her ministrations and flexing his fingers like he was testing their readiness for another fight. The bills disappeared into his shirt pocket with practiced speed. Luella's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird trying to break free. "Who's here, Papa?" For the first time that morning, Ezekiel looked directly at her, and she saw something in his pale eyes that made her blood turn to ice water. It wasn't anger this time, or disgust, or even indifference. It was relief, the kind of relief a man feels when he's finally found a way to rid himself of a burden he never wanted to carry. "The buyer," he said simply. Outside, the carriage wheels crunched to a stop, and Luella heard the soft thud of expensive boots hitting the ground. Through their cracked window, she glimpsed polished black leather and a coat that probably cost more than their house was worth. Ezekiel stood, straightening his stained shirt like he was preparing for church instead of whatever this was. "Remember what I told you, girl. Keep your mouth shut, keep your eyes down, and maybe this'll go smooth for both of us." The knock that came at their door 3 minutes later was soft, almost polite, but it echoed through Luella's chest like thunder. The man who stepped through their doorway looked nothing like the monsters Luella had conjured in her nightmares. Darian Thorne moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd never known hunger, never felt the sting of a calloused hand across his cheek, never scrubbed blood from another person's knuckles while his own stomach gnawed at itself. His coat was midnight black wool that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and when he removed his leather gloves, his hands were softer than any man's had a right to be. But it was his eyes that made Luella's breath catch in her throat, not because they were cruel or calculating like she'd expected, but because they looked at her with something she'd never seen directed her way before. Something that might have been tenderness if she'd known what tenderness looked like. "Miss Luella," Darian said, and her name sounded different in his mouth, like he was tasting honey instead of speaking about damaged goods. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Ezekiel cleared his throat with the rough bark of a man who'd spent too many years smoking cheap tobacco. She's exactly what we discussed, Mr. Thorne. Healthy, obedient, and she knows her place. Ain't that right, girl? Luella's eyes remained fixed on the warped floorboards, but she could feel Darian's gaze on her like warm sunlight through a window. It didn't feel like the way other men looked at her, like they were cataloging her flaws or measuring her against some impossible standard. It felt like he was seeing something everyone else had missed. Actually, Darian's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made even Ezekiel straighten unconsciously. I'd prefer to hear from Miss Luella herself. The request hit the room like lightning striking dry wood. In 20 years, no one had ever asked for Luella's opinion about anything, let alone in front of her father. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for water, but no sound emerged. Ezekiel's face darkened like storm clouds gathering before a tornado. She ain't got nothing to say that you need to hear. We agreed on a price, and I've delivered exactly what I requested. Darian finished smoothly, but there was steel beneath his silk tone now. And what I requested was the opportunity to meet the young woman who's captured my attention so completely. Captured his attention? Luella's heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape through her throat. She risked lifting her eyes just enough to glimpse his face, and what she saw there made her world tilt sideways. He was looking at her like she was precious. The bag of coins that exchanged hands between the two men sounded like 30 pieces of silver hitting the floor, but Darian never took his eyes off her face. Not even when Ezekiel counted the money twice, his greedy fingers trembling with excitement at having finally rid himself of his greatest shame. She's got a few rough edges, Ezekiel was saying, stuffing the bills into his pocket like they might disappear if he wasn't quick enough. Stubborn streak a mile wide, and she ain't much to look at, but she'll work hard if you keep her in line. I'm sure she's perfect exactly as she is, Darian replied, and something in his tone made Ezekiel's babbling fade into background noise. Perfect. The word echoed in Luella's mind like a prayer she'd never dared to whisper. No one had ever called her perfect. Most days, she wasn't even called by her name. When Darian extended his arm toward her, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering, she stared at his hand like it might bite her. The skin was pale and unmarked, with long fingers that looked like they'd never known manual labor. Everything about him whispered of softness and safety, but Luella had learned long ago that appearances could be more dangerous than any truth. "Shall we go home, Miss Luella?" he asked gently. Home. Another word that felt foreign on her tongue, another concept she'd only observed from the outside looking in. But when she placed her trembling hand in his fingers closed around hers with surprising warmth. And for the first time in 20 years, Luella wondered if maybe home wasn't a place at all. Maybe it was a person who looked at you like you were worth something. The carriage that waited outside was more luxurious than anything Luella had ever seen, with cushioned seats covered in deep burgundy velvet and windows made of actual glass instead of oiled cloth. As Darian helped her climb inside, she caught a glimpse of her father through their kitchen window, already pouring himself a celebration drink with her blood money. But as the carriage pulled away and her past grew smaller in the distance, Luella couldn't shake the feeling that she was trading one cage for another, even if this new one was lined with silk. The Thorne estate rose from the Virginia countryside like something torn from a fairy tale and planted in reality without asking permission first. Luella pressed her face against the carriage window as they approached, her breath fogging the glass while her eyes tried to take in towers that scraped the belly of storm clouds, gardens that stretched further than her father's entire property, and windows that glittered like captured stars even in the afternoon gloom. The circular driveway was paved with stones so perfectly fitted they looked like they'd grown from the earth instead of being placed by human hands. "It's overwhelming at first," Darian said softly, and she realized he'd been watching her reaction instead of admiring his own domain. "But I hope you'll come to think of it as home." Home. There was that word again, spoken like an invitation instead of a command. When the carriage stopped, 3 servants materialized as if they'd been waiting their entire lives for this specific moment. But instead of reaching for Luella like she was cargo to be unloaded, they stepped back respectfully while Darian helped her down himself, his hand steady under her elbow as her legs remembered how to hold her weight. "Welcome home, Miss Luella," said a woman with silver hair swept into a perfect bun and clothes that probably cost more than everything Luella had ever owned combined. I'm Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, the head of household. We've been preparing for your arrival. Preparing for her arrival? Luella's mind stumbled over the concept like feet finding unexpected stairs in the dark. No one had ever prepared anything for her except maybe a beating when she'd forgotten to complete some impossible list of chores. The foyer they entered stole what little breath she had left. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, supported by marble columns that looked like they'd been carved by angels with too much time on their hands. A chandelier hung from the center like a crystal waterfall frozen mid-fall, casting rainbow fragments across walls covered in paintings of people who looked too beautiful to have ever existed. But it was the staircase that made her knees go weak, a sweeping curve of polished wood with a banister so smooth it seemed to beg for touching, leading up to mysteries she couldn't even imagine. Your room is prepared, Mrs. Ashworth continued, and dinner will be served at 7. Master Darian thought you might prefer to rest after your journey. Master Darian thought about what she might prefer? Luella's hand found the wall for support because surely she was dreaming. Surely she'd fallen asleep in that rickety carriage and her mind had conjured this impossibility to protect her from whatever reality actually awaited. Actually, Darian's voice cut through her spiral of disbelief. I was hoping Miss Luella might join me for tea first. There's something I'd like to show her. He led her through corridors lined with more paintings than she'd seen in her entire life. Past rooms glimpsed through doorway cracks that revealed libraries with books stacked floor to ceiling. Sitting rooms with furniture that looked like it had never been used for anything as mundane as sitting, and windows draped in fabric that probably cost more than her father made in a year. The conservatory he brought her to took her remaining composure and shattered it like glass hitting stone. It was a room made entirely of windows and light, filled with flowers that had no business blooming in October, butterflies that danced through air thick with the perfume of impossible gardens, and the sound of water trickling from a fountain carved to look like angels weeping tears of joy. I spend most of my mornings here, Darian said, gesturing for her to sit in a chair that was more comfortable than her bed had ever been. It reminds me that beautiful things can thrive even when the world outside seems harsh. Tea appeared as if summoned by magic. Delicate china cups that clinked like wind chimes, pastries that looked too perfect to eat, and steam that rose from the pot carrying scents she couldn't name but somehow made her feel safe. Tell me about yourself, Luella, Darian said, settling across from her with the fluid grace of someone who'd never doubted his right to take up space in the world. What do you love? What makes you happy? The questions hit her like physical blows. What did she love? What made her happy? She'd spent 20 years focused on survival, on avoiding Ezekiel's fists and disappointment, on making herself small enough to avoid notice. She'd never been allowed the luxury of preferences, let alone happiness. She started, then stopped, her voice catching like fabric on thorns. I don't know. Instead of looking disappointed or frustrated like everyone else did when she failed to meet expectations, Darian's expression softened with something that might have been understanding. That's perfectly fine, he said gently. We have all the time in the world to discover those things together. But I can tell you what I see when I look at you. Luella's heart stopped beating entirely, her hands frozen around the teacup that suddenly felt too heavy to hold. No one had ever volunteered to tell her what they saw when they looked at her, probably because the truth would have been too cruel for even Ezekiel to speak aloud. I see intelligence in your eyes that's been forced to hide itself, Darian continued, his voice soft as silk brushing against skin. I see strength that's been tested by fire and emerged unbroken. I see a heart that's learned to protect itself but hasn't learned to stop hoping. Each word fell on her like gentle rain on soil that had been drought dry for decades, and she felt something inside her chest beginning to unfurl like a flower that had never seen sunlight. And I see beauty, he finished quietly. That has nothing to do with what mirrors reflect and everything to do with the light that lives behind your eyes. Luella's reflection in the conservatory windows showed her the same crooked nose, the same thin lips, the same scar cutting through her left eyebrow that had earned her nothing but disgust for 20 years. But when she looked back at Darian, his expression held the kind of reverence people usually reserve for sunsets and newborn babies, and other miracles they couldn't quite explain. For the first time in her life, someone was looking at her like she was the miracle. The bedroom Mrs. Ashworth led her to defied every expectation Luella had carried about what a room could be. Sunlight poured through windows tall enough for giants. Illuminating walls painted the color of morning sky and furniture that looked like it belonged in a palace rather than a place where someone actually slept. The bed dominated the space like a cloud that had decided to take solid form. For posts carved with intricate roses supporting a canopy of silk that whispered secrets when the breeze moved through it. But it was the wardrobe that made her legs forget how to hold her weight. Mrs. Ashworth opened the doors with theatrical flourish, revealing dresses in colors Luella didn't have names for. Emerald silk that seemed to capture light and hold it prisoner. Midnight blue velvet soft as a lover's whisper. Rose gold satin that shimmered like captured sunset. Each gown hung like a prayer waiting to be answered, and every single one looked like it had been made for someone with her exact measurements. Master Darian had these commissioned based on his description of you, Mrs. Ashworth explained, but something in her tone made Luella's skin prickle with unease. He was quite specific about the colors. Said they would complement your complexion perfectly. Luella stared at her reflection in the wardrobe's mirror. The same pale, sallow skin that had never complimented anything, stretched over bones that jutted out like accusations. How could Darian have described her complexion when he'd barely glanced at her during their transaction with Ezekiel? He's been planning your arrival for quite some time, Mrs. Ashworth continued, her fingers smoothing invisible wrinkles from a dress the color of deep water. Months, actually. Ever since he received word about your situation. The word situation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, carrying implications Luella didn't understand but instinctively feared. That night, after a dinner that felt more like a dream than a meal, courses she couldn't name served on plates that belonged in museums, conversation that treated her opinions like they mattered, wine that tasted like liquid starlight, Luella found herself alone in her magnificent prison of a bedroom, unable to sleep despite the mattress that felt like sleeping on a cloud. The house settled around her with the creaks and sighs of old wood and older secrets. But underneath those familiar sounds, she heard something else. Music, faint as a whisper, drifting through the walls like a ghost trying to remember how to sing. Her bare feet found the cold marble of the floor before her mind fully decided to investigate. The hallway stretched in both directions, lit by moonlight streaming through stained glass windows that painted the walls in blues and purples and silvers. The music grew stronger as she followed it, a melody so hauntingly beautiful it made her chest ache with longing for something she couldn't name. It led her to a door at the far end of the east wing, heavy oak carved with symbols that looked almost like letters, but not quite, almost like flowers, but not exactly. The music box melody tinkled from beyond like a memory, trying to become real again. The door was locked, but the keyhole was large enough to peer through, and what Luella saw on the other side made her heart forget how to beat. Portraits, dozens of them, covering every wall like a gallery dedicated to feminine beauty. But these weren't the classical paintings that decorated the rest of the house. These were recent, intimate, painted with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of obsession rather than mere admiration. 7 different women stared back at her through the keyhole, each more breathtaking than the last. A redhead with skin like porcelain and lips that could have inspired wars. A brunette with eyes the color of chocolate and curves that belonged in Renaissance paintings. A blonde with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and a smile that promised secrets worth dying for. Each portrait bore the same inscription at the bottom, "My beautiful beloved." And beside each painting sat a music box, identical to the one still playing its melancholy tune in the darkness beyond her sight. Luella's reflection caught in a mirror propped against the door frame, and the contrast was so stark it felt like a physical slap. These women were goddesses made flesh, creatures so perfect they seemed to glow with inner light. She was herself. Crooked nose, thin lips, scar tissue, and bones that never learned how to carry softness. How could Darian look at her and see anything worth painting? How could he call her beautiful when beauty like this existed in the world, when he'd clearly known beauty intimate enough to commission portraits of it? The music box fell silent with a final, mournful note that seemed to echo through her bones. And in that silence, Luella heard something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Footsteps, moving through the house with purpose and familiarity, heading directly toward where she stood frozen in front of the forbidden door. She ran back to her room on feet that barely touched the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird trying to beat itself to death against its bars. But even after she buried herself under covers that smelled like lavender and safety, even after the footsteps passed her door and continued down the hallway, she couldn't shake the image of those 7 beautiful faces, or the terrible certainty that she was meant to be the 8th portrait in that hidden gallery. The question that kept her staring at the ceiling until dawn crept through her windows wasn't whether Darian intended to paint her picture. It was what had happened to the 7 women whose portraits already hung on those walls, and why their music boxes played songs that sounded suspiciously like funeral dirges. Outside her window, she could swear she heard the soft scrape of a shovel biting into earth, rhythmic and purposeful, like someone was digging holes meant to stay filled. The days that followed blurred together like watercolors bleeding into each other during a rainstorm, each one more surreal than the last. Darian's attention became a constant presence, warm and suffocating as a fever that refused to break. He appeared at breakfast with flowers that matched what he called the exact shade of rose in your cheeks, though Luella's mirror showed her the same pale, hollow-cheeked reflection it always had. He commissioned a portrait artist who worked with his eyes closed, painting from Darian's whispered descriptions of curves and colors that existed nowhere on Luella's actual body. The slope of her shoulders, Darian would murmur while the artist's brush moved across canvas, like a swan preparing to take flight. And her hands, delicate as morning frost, graceful as prayer. Luella would stare down at her own hands, calloused from years of scrubbing floors, scarred from kitchen accidents, nails bitten down to the quick from nervous habits, and wonder if Darian was looking at someone else entirely. Someone invisible standing just behind her, someone worthy of the poetry that spilled from his lips like water from a broken dam. The touching started innocently enough, a hand on her elbow to guide her through doorways, fingers brushing hers when he passed her tea. But gradually, inevitably, his need to map her face with his fingertips became as regular as sunrise, as inescapable as breathing. "Let me see you," he would whisper in the library while autumn rain drummed against windows tall as cathedral doors. His hands would frame her face like he was holding something infinitely precious, thumbs tracing the scar through her eyebrow with the reverence most people reserved for religious artifacts. "Your skin is like silk," he would breathe, though Luella could feel the roughness under his touch, the places where childhood scars had never properly healed. "And your eyes? God, Luella, your eyes hold entire universes." She would sit perfectly still during these moments, afraid to move or speak or breathe too deeply in case it shattered whatever spell made him see beauty where none existed. But late at night, alone in her fairy tale bedroom, she would touch her own face and feel nothing but the familiar landscape of imperfection she'd carried for 20 years. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when storm clouds gathered like bruises across the October sky. Darian found her in the music room, where she'd been sitting at the piano bench despite never having learned to play, her fingers resting on keys that sang pure notes even when touched by someone who had no right to make music. He approached from behind with that silent grace of his, and before she could prepare herself, his hands were cupping her face again. "My beautiful Luella," he whispered against her ear, his breath warm and carrying the scent of mint and madness. "Sometimes I think you don't realize how extraordinary you are." This time, something inside her snapped like a wire pulled too tight. "Stop." The word escaped before she could catch it, sharp and desperate as a drowning person's last gasp for air. "Please, just stop." Darian's hands stilled against her cheeks, but he didn't pull away. If anything, his grip tightened with the possessiveness of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. "Stop what, my love? Stop calling me beautiful." The confession tumbled out like blood from a wound that had been festering too long. "Stop pretending you see something that isn't there. Stop looking at me like I'm some kind of miracle when we both know what I really am." The silence that followed was so complete, She could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the music room walls. When Darian finally spoke, his voice carried a quality she'd never heard before, something cold and sharp as winter wind cutting through bare trees. "What you really are," he repeated slowly, "is the most beautiful woman I've ever encountered. And if you can't see that, if you insist on believing the lies that small-minded people have filled your head with, then perhaps we need to work harder on helping you understand your own worth." His fingers pressed deeper into her skin, hard enough to leave marks that would bloom purple by morning. "I didn't rescue you from that hovel so you could continue poisoning yourself with self-hatred, Luella. I brought you here to show you truth." But whose truth? The question screamed through her mind as his hands held her face like a cage made of flesh and bone and desperate need. His truth, where she was a goddess worthy of worship. Or her truth, where she was exactly what her father had always said she was, damaged goods that someone had been fool enough to pay for? "Look at me," Darian commanded, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than any shout. "Look at me and tell me what you see." Luella forced herself to meet his gaze, and what she found there made her stomach turn to lead. His eyes held the fevered intensity of a man who'd lost the ability to distinguish between reality and the stories he told himself to sleep at night. They were the eyes of someone who would reshape the world rather than admit he might be wrong about any part of it. "I see someone who's trying very hard to make me into something I'm not," she whispered, because honesty felt like the only weapon she had left. Darian's smile was beautiful and terrible as a rose blooming in a graveyard. "Oh, my darling girl," he said softly, his thumb still stroking her cheekbones like he was polishing something precious. "You have no idea what you are yet. But don't worry, I'm going to spend every day for the rest of our lives showing you." The promise in his voice sounded less like love and more like a life sentence. And as thunder rolled across the estate like God's own warning, Luella realized that sometimes the most dangerous prisons were the ones that called themselves paradise. The midnight melody that had haunted Luella's dreams for weeks finally revealed its purpose on a night when November wind howled through the estate like souls trying to claw their way back to the living. She'd learned to time her explorations to Darian's schedule. He disappeared every night at 11:30 sharp, vanishing into some corner of the mansion she hadn't discovered yet, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and the weight of expectations she couldn't fulfill. Tonight, armed with a candle stolen from the dining room and courage borrowed from desperation, she made her way back to the forbidden door. The lock had been changed since her last visit, a heavy iron thing that spoke of secrets worth protecting, but the keyhole was still large enough to reveal the gallery of beautiful faces beyond. 7 women, 7 music boxes, 7 lives that had intersected with Darian's and somehow ended in oil paint and silence. The melody drifted through the wood like a prayer for the dead, but tonight it carried something else. The sound of paper rustling, pages turning with the deliberate rhythm of someone reading in the darkness. "I know you're out there." The voice that came through the keyhole made Luella's candle flame dance like it was trying to escape its wick. Female, cultured, with the kind of refined accent that belonged to women in those portraits, but underneath the polish was something raw and desperate as a cornered animal. "You're the new one, aren't you? The 8th girl he's brought to fill his collection." Luella's hand found the wall for support because her knees had suddenly remembered they were made of water instead of bone. Who are you?" "My name is Evangeline Blackthorne," the voice replied, and Luella heard the soft sound of someone moving closer to the door. "I was supposed to be portrait number 3. That was 8 months ago." 8 months. The number hit Luella like ice water to the face because it meant this woman had been living in that room, surrounded by pictures of her fellow captives, for 8 months, while Darian pretended she didn't exist. "How are you still alive?" Luella whispered, pressing her ear to the wood like she could absorb answers through her skin. "Because I learned to play his game before it killed me," Evangeline replied, her voice carrying the bitter wisdom of someone who'd survived by becoming someone else entirely. "But more importantly, because I found what he keeps hidden behind the portraits." The sound of something heavy sliding across floor reached through the door, followed by the distinct click of a hidden compartment opening. "Journals," Evangeline continued, "written by every woman who came before us. They all start the same way: gratitude for being rescued, confusion about his devotion, slowly growing unease as his love becomes possession. And they all in the same way too. Luella's throat closed like a fist was squeezing it from the inside. How do they end? With the realization that Darian doesn't love women. He loves the idea of women. Perfect, grateful, beautiful women who exist only to reflect his fantasy of himself as a savior. And when reality starts bleeding through the cracks of his delusion, the sentence hung unfinished, but Luella didn't need to hear the end to understand. She'd seen enough graves in the garden, heard enough of that midnight digging, felt enough of the possessive grip in Darian's fingers when she dared to contradict his version of her beauty. The first journal belongs to Isadora Fairfax, Evangeline whispered, and Luella could hear pages turning like autumn leaves falling. 16 years old, sold by her stepmother for gambling debts. Darian called her his porcelain doll and commissioned music boxes that played her favorite song. When she tried to tell him she actually preferred different music, he locked her in here until she remembered her true preferences. More pages rustled, each one sounding like a gravestone being etched. Then came Vivian Rose Hart, 17, traded by her guardian for business connections. She lasted 3 months before she made the mistake of cutting her hair without permission. Darian said she'd destroyed her crowning glory and needed to be reminded of her purpose. The litany continued, each name a life reduced to a mistake that had cost everything. Women who'd spoken too freely, expressed opinions that contradicted his image of feminine perfection, shown aspects of their personalities that didn't fit his carefully constructed fairy tale. But here's what none of them understood until it was too late. Evangeline said, her voice dropping to barely more than breath against wood. Darian isn't just collecting beautiful women. He's collecting women he can transform into his version of beautiful. Women the world has already rejected, already broken down, already convinced they're worthless. The realization hit Luella like lightning splitting an oak tree in half. Her father's words echoed in her memory. She ain't much to look at. Darian's response. I'm sure she's perfect exactly as she is. He hadn't chosen her despite her supposed ugliness. He'd chosen her because of it. He needs us to be grateful, Evangeline continued, desperate enough to accept any version of love, even the kind that erases everything we actually are. He takes women who've been told they're nothing and convinces them they're everything, as long as they never contradict his vision of what everything should look like. The footsteps Luella had learned to recognize were approaching down the hallway, and she knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before Darian discovered her eavesdropping on secrets that could cost her more than she was prepared to lose. Tomorrow night, Evangeline whispered urgently. Same time. There's something else you need to see, something about the garden and what he's really growing there besides roses. Luella fled back to her room on silent feet, but sleep remained as elusive as truth in a house built on beautiful lies. As she lay staring at the ceiling painted with cherubs and clouds, she couldn't stop thinking about 7 music boxes playing funeral songs for women who'd made the mistake of being human instead of perfect. And somewhere in the walls around her, she could swear she heard the sound of someone crying, soft, hopeless sobs that seemed to seep through the very foundation of Darian's paradise like blood through bandages that could never quite stop the bleeding. The garden at 3 in the morning held secrets that daylight was too kind to reveal. Luella followed Evangeline's whispered directions through corridors that seemed to shift and breathe in the darkness, past paintings whose eyes tracked her movement like they were keeping score of her sins. The hidden passage behind the kitchen pantry opened with a sound like bones cracking, revealing stairs that spiraled down into earth that smelled of decay and roses growing too close together. She emerged through a concealed door disguised as a gardening shed, and what she found in the moonlight made her stomach turn to acid. 7 raised flower beds arranged in perfect symmetry, each one 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, each one marked with a headstone carved from marble that gleamed like teeth in the darkness. But these weren't the decorative graves she'd glimpsed from her bedroom window. These were real burial plots, fresh earth still dark with moisture, roses blooming in shades of red too deep to be natural. Beautiful, isn't it? Evangeline's voice came from the shadows near a marble angel whose face had been carved to look eternally sorrowful. He plants them in soil enriched with what's left of their dreams. Luella's candle trembled in her grip, wax dripping onto her fingers like tears that burned. They're really dead? All of them. Oh yes. Evangeline stepped into the light, and Luella saw her clearly for the first time. A woman who might have been beautiful once, before hollow cheeks and haunted eyes had carved suffering into her features like a sculptor working in flesh. But not in the way you're thinking. She led Luella deeper into the garden, past fountain cherubs whose smiles looked more sinister than sweet, to a greenhouse hidden behind a curtain of weeping willow branches. Inside, illuminated by lanterns that cast dancing shadows on glass walls, was a workshop that belonged in nightmares rather than reality. Tables covered with artists' supplies, paints in every shade imaginable, brushes fine enough to capture individual eyelashes, canvases stretched tight as drumheads waiting for their first stroke. But also surgical tools that gleamed like silver promises, bottles filled with liquids that had no business existing in the same room as art supplies, and mirrors, dozens of mirrors reflecting their shocked faces back at them in fragments. This is where he creates his masterpieces, Evangeline said, her voice hollow as whined through empty rooms. Not just the portraits, the women themselves. He doesn't kill us, Luella. He remakes us. On the central table, spread out like a blueprint for transformation, were detailed sketches of facial reconstruction. Notes written in Darian's careful handwriting described procedures with clinical precision. Narrow the nose by 2 millimeters. Soften the jawline to create more feminine curves. Remove scar tissue through controlled abrasion. Luella's hand flew to her own face, fingers tracing the scar through her eyebrow that Darian touched so lovingly. The crooked nose that he claimed was perfectly proportioned, the thin lips he described as rose petals waiting to bloom. He's planning to change me, she breathed, understanding flooding through her like poison through veins. Not change, Evangeline corrected grimly. Perfect. In his mind, he's not destroying who you are. He's revealing who you were always meant to be. The women in those portraits? They all started out looking like us. Rejected, scarred, convinced they were worthless. By the time he finished with them, they were exactly as beautiful as he'd always insisted they were. But the graves are for the women they used to be, Evangeline finished. Isadora Fairfax died on this table 8 years ago. The woman who lived in her body afterward was someone else entirely. Someone who agreed with everything Darian said, never questioned his version of reality, and existed solely to validate his fantasy of himself as a man who could love the unlovable. The surgical tools gleamed under the lantern light like instruments of salvation that had forgotten they were supposed to heal rather than remake. Luella could imagine herself strapped to that table, Darian's gentle hands holding scalpels instead of teacups, his voice whispering sweet encouragements while he carved away everything that made her herself. How did you escape? Evangeline's laugh was bitter as medicine that cured by burning everything it touched. I didn't escape. I'm still here, aren't I? Still playing hide and seek in the walls of his palace, still jumping at every footstep, still trapped by the certainty that the moment I try to leave, I'll end up on that table having my inconvenient personality surgically removed. She turned to face Luella fully, and in the fractured light of the greenhouse, her features seemed to shift and change like she was already becoming someone else. The only reason I'm still alive is because I learned to give him exactly what he wanted before he decided to take it by force. I became grateful, compliant, beautiful in all the ways he demanded. But you, her eyes fixed on Luella's face with the intensity of someone seeing their own reflection in a funhouse mirror. You still have fight in you. You still question things. And that makes you dangerous to his carefully constructed world. Thunder rolled across the estate like God clearing his throat before delivering judgment, and in the distance, Luella could hear footsteps moving through the mansion with purpose that made her skin crawl with certainty. He's looking for you, Evangeline whispered, blowing out the lanterns with practiced efficiency. And when Darian comes looking for something he owns, he always finds it. As they slipped back through the hidden passages like ghosts fleeing a haunted house, Luella carried with her the terrible knowledge that she had perhaps days, maybe hours, before her face would join the collection of perfected women whose music boxes played lullabies for the dead. The question that burned through her mind as she climbed back to her fairy tale bedroom wasn't whether she could escape Darian's love. It was whether any part of the real Luella would survive the process of becoming beautiful enough to deserve it. The morning Luella's world shattered started with Darian standing at the foot of her bed, holding a hand mirror and wearing a smile that belonged on angels who'd forgotten how to be kind. "Today's the day, my beautiful darling," he said, his voice soft as silk wrapping around a blade. "Today we help you become everything you were always meant to be." Sunlight streamed through her windows, illuminating the surgical instruments laid out on her vanity table like a twisted tea service. Scalpels that caught light and threw it back in silver promises. Bottles filled with liquids that would steal consciousness and pain in equal measure. And that mirror, polished to perfection so she could watch herself transform from mistake into masterpiece. "I've been patient," Darian continued, settling on the edge of her bed with the casual intimacy of someone who'd never questioned his right to invade any space he pleased. "I've given you time to adjust, to understand what I'm offering you. But your self-hatred has become a poison that's infected our entire relationship." He lifted the mirror, angling it so she could see her reflection framed by his hands. The same crooked nose, thin lips, and scar-bisected eyebrow that had earned her nothing but disgust for 20 years. But now she also saw something else, determination burning in her eyes like fire catching dry wood. "Look at this face," Darian commanded gently, his grip tightening on the mirror's handle until his knuckles went white. "Really look at it, Luella. See past the lies your father planted in your mind. See the bone structure that just needs refinement, the features that require only minor adjustments to reveal their true beauty." "I see my face," Luella said quietly, and something in her tone made Darian's smile falter like a candle flame touched by sudden wind. "My real face. The one my mother gave me before she died, trying to birth me into a world that would hate everything about how I looked." The mirror cracked, not from impact, but from the pressure of Darian's fingers gripping its edges hard enough to fracture glass into spider web patterns that divided her reflection into fragments. "Don't," he said, his voice dropping to the whisper he used right before his touches became painful. "Don't you dare poison this moment with more of your father's toxic lies. You're beautiful, Luella. You've always been beautiful. And today, the whole world will finally be able to see what I've seen from the very beginning." But something had shifted in the space between his words and her understanding, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the surface of an earthquake that hadn't decided whether to destroy everything yet. For the first time since arriving at his estate, Luella looked directly into Darian's eyes and spoke truth instead of the gratitude he demanded. "You can't see anything," she said simply. "You're blind." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Darian's hands went perfectly still against the cracked mirror, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quality she'd never heard before, something cold and sharp as winter wind cutting through dead trees. "What did you say?" "You're blind," Luella repeated, and each word felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness with no certainty of landing. "You've been blind since birth. That's why you describe my beauty in ways that don't match what mirrors show. That's why you need to touch my face to see me. That's why you commission portraits based on descriptions instead of observation." Darian's laugh was beautiful and terrible as a song played at a funeral. "Oh, my darling girl. My poor, confused, self-hating darling girl." The mirror slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble floor, glass fragments catching morning light and throwing it back in 1,000 accusatory directions. "You think blindness excuses what I've done? You think physical sight is the only way to see truth?" His hands found her face with the unerring accuracy of someone who'd memorized every inch of her features, but now his touch felt like being marked for slaughter. "I see you more clearly than you've ever seen yourself. I see the beauty that exists beyond the superficial prison your father trapped you in." His thumbs pressed against her cheekbones hard enough to leave bruises that would bloom purple as dying flowers. "And today, I'm going to make sure everyone else can see it too." The sound that saved her life came from somewhere deep in the house, a crash like worlds colliding, followed by the acrid smell of smoke that turned sweet air into something that burned her lungs. Darian's head snapped toward the sound with predatory alertness, his hands loosening their grip just enough for Luella to pull away. "Evangeline," he breathed, understanding flooding his features like sunrise over a battlefield. "That clever, ungrateful little ghost." More crashes echoed through the estate, accompanied by the hungry crackle of flames finding fuel in expensive furniture and priceless paintings. Somewhere in the distance, Mrs. Ashworth was shouting orders to servants who might not live long enough to follow them. "She's destroying my life's work," Darian said, his voice carrying the broken quality of someone watching their carefully constructed world crumble into ash and memory. 20 years of perfecting my craft, of creating beauty where none existed before, and she's burning it all because she's too damaged to appreciate what she was given. He turned back to Luella with eyes that held the fevered intensity of a man who'd lost everything except his delusions. "But I still have you. I can still save you from the ugliness that's poisoned your mind since birth." The surgical tools gleamed on her vanity table like promises of transformation that required only her submission to become reality. But as smoke began seeping under her bedroom door and the taste of ash filled her mouth, Luella realized that some promises were threats wearing prettier clothes. "No," she said, backing toward the windows that suddenly looked less like sources of light and more like potential escape routes. "No, you can't save me from anything, because I was never broken to begin with." Darian's smile was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she'd ever seen. "Oh, my love," he said softly, picking up a scalpel that caught firelight and held it like captured lightning. "You will be." Fire had a way of revealing truth that daylight was too polite to expose. Luella's bare feet found purchase on ivy-covered stones as she climbed down from her bedroom window, 3 stories of Virginia mansion burning above her like a funeral pyre for beautiful lies. The estate that had seemed like paradise just hours ago now looked like what it had always been, a mausoleum for women who'd made the mistake of believing they deserved love without conditions. Smoke poured from windows like souls escaping purgatory, carrying with it the scent of oil paint burning, silk curtains turning to ash, and 20 years of Darian's carefully constructed fantasies finally meeting reality. Somewhere in that inferno, she could hear him calling her name with the desperate quality of someone watching his religion crumble. "Luella, my beautiful, perfect Luella." But she was already running toward the garden where Evangeline waited beside the fountain of weeping angels, a leather satchel clutched against her chest like armor made of evidence and rage. "The journals." Evangeline gasped, her face streaked with soot and something that might have been tears or might have been rain from clouds that had gathered to watch the spectacle. "I saved the journals and the correspondence. Letters between Darian and the men who sold us, receipts for surgical equipment, photographs of us before and after." Before and after. The words hit Luella like physical blows because they meant Evangeline had photographic proof of what Darian's version of love actually looked like when stripped of poetry and promises. "We have to get them to the authorities," Luella said. But even as the words left her mouth, she heard the sound that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Hoofbeats. A single horse approaching at full gallop, and she knew with the terrible certainty of someone who'd spent 20 years learning to recognize the sounds of incoming violence that rescue wasn't riding toward them through the darkness. Ezekiel Rourke emerged from the smoke and shadows like a demon summoned by the scent of burning money, his face twisted with rage that made his usual cruelty look like gentle affection. He dismounted his horse with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent his life chasing down things that tried to run from him. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled, striding toward them with fists already clenched for violence. "You burned down a perfectly good business arrangement, and now you're going to pay for every dollar of damage." Behind him, the estate continued its spectacular destruction, flames reaching toward heaven like prayers spoken in a language God had forgotten how to understand. But Ezekiel's attention was focused entirely on Luella, his pale eyes holding the same possessive fury she'd seen in Darian's gaze. The look of men who believed women were property that had forgotten its place. "Mr. Thorne sent word that his merchandise was defective," Ezekiel continued, close enough now that she could smell whiskey and tobacco and the metallic scent of violence on his breath. "Said you'd been corrupted by outside influences, turned against the gift he was trying to give you." So we're going back to the original agreement. He pulled a rope from his belt with the casual efficiency of someone who'd tied up livestock his entire life. He's got a new facility, smaller and more controlled. Somewhere you can't be poisoned by jealous women who don't understand what it means to be chosen for greatness. The rope felt like destiny closing around her wrists. But before Ezekiel could complete the knot, Evangeline stepped between them with the feral grace of someone who'd finally decided that dying on her feet was better than living on her knees. She's not going anywhere with you. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before a duel, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the three of them stood frozen in tableau. Ezekiel with his rope and rage, Evangeline with her satchel of evidence and 8 months of accumulated fury, and Luella caught between the past that had shaped her and the future that was trying to claim her. Then Ezekiel's fist connected with Evangeline's jaw with a sound like wood splitting, and time resumed its forward march toward violence. But something unexpected happened as Evangeline hit the ground. Instead of staying down like women were supposed to when men decided to hurt them, she rolled to her feet with blood streaming from her split lip and smiled like someone who'd just remembered she had nothing left to lose. "You want to know the beautiful thing about rock bottom?" she asked Ezekiel, wiping blood from her mouth with the back of her hand. "There's nowhere to fall from there." The satchel flew through the air between them, and as its contents scattered across the garden like evidence demanding justice, photographs caught moonlight and revealed faces that told stories no courtroom should ever have to hear. Women who'd started out looking broken and ended up looking perfect, their eyes holding the empty beauty of dolls who'd forgotten they used to be human. Ezekiel lunged for the scattered papers like a man trying to catch his own condemnation before it could reach the ears of people who might care about justice. But Luella was already moving. 20 years of avoiding his fists had taught her to be quick when survival depended on it, and survival had never depended on anything more than it did right now. Her foot caught him behind the knee with all the force she could summon, and as he fell forward into the fountain of weeping angels, she heard the sound of his skull connecting with marble carved by artisans who'd never intended their work to draw blood. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of flames consuming lies and the gentle splash of fountain water washing away sins that had stained the earth for too long. Ezekiel floated face down among stone angels whose tears finally had a purpose, and Luella felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg hatching something that had been waiting 20 years to be born. "Is he dead?" she whispered. Evangeline knelt beside the fountain, her fingers checking for a pulse that would either damn them or set them free. "Does it matter?" she asked finally. "Either way, he can't hurt you anymore." Dawn was breaking over the Virginia countryside like a promise that beautiful things could exist without requiring sacrifice. And as Luella stood in the garden surrounded by evidence of horrors and hope in equal measure, she realized that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. Not because someone had chosen her, but because she had finally chosen herself. 6 months later, Luella stood before a mirror in a boarding house in Richmond and saw herself clearly for the first time in 20 years. The reflection staring back at her held the same crooked nose that had earned her father's disgust, the same thin lips that would never inspire poetry, the same scar cutting through her left eyebrow, like a reminder that some wounds leave marks worth keeping. But there was something else now, something that hadn't existed in any mirror she'd looked into before, the steady gaze of someone who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. "You ready for this?" Evangeline asked from behind her, adjusting the simple blue dress that Luella had chosen specifically because it was comfortable rather than beautiful, practical rather than perfect. Today they were testifying before a grand jury about the Thorne estate, about surgical theaters disguised as greenhouses and love that required anesthesia to survive. The evidence they'd salvaged from the fire had been enough to launch an investigation that reached into places Luella had never imagined. Other estates, other collections, other men who believed broken women made the most grateful wives. "I'm ready," Luella said, and meant it. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters whose cameras flashed like lightning, trying to capture truth in silver and shadow. But Luella walked through them with her head high and her shoulders straight. No longer the girl who'd kept her eyes on floorboards to avoid seeing disgust in other people's faces. Inside, families waited. Mothers and fathers and sisters who'd been told their daughters had run away, wives who'd been disappeared, women who'd been sold and forgotten by everyone except the people who'd loved them before money changed everything. Some wept when they saw the photographs. Others sat in stunned silence as the scope of Darian's operation became clear. But it was the young girl sitting in the back row who made Luella's testimony catch in her throat. 15 years old, maybe 16, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd learned too early that the people who were supposed to protect you were often the ones most eager to profit from your pain. Her father sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder with the possessive weight of ownership rather than affection, and when their eyes met across the courtroom, Luella saw her own past reflected in that girl's terror. The defendant would approach women who'd been rejected by their families, Luella testified, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. He specifically targeted those of us who'd been told we were worthless, ugly, damaged. He knew that grateful people ask fewer questions. As she spoke, the girl in the back row grew paler, her father's grip on her shoulder tightening until she flinched with pain that had nothing to do with physical pressure and everything to do with recognition. After the session ended, after reporters had gotten their quotes and families had gotten their answers and justice had taken one small step toward catching up with crimes that had been running free for too long, Luella found the girl crying on the courthouse steps. "He's planning to sell me," the girl whispered without looking up, her voice barely audible above the traffic and chaos of a city that had learned to ignore other people's pain. "Said there's a man in South Carolina who's interested in giving me opportunities my face would never earn on its own." Luella sat beside her on stone steps still warm from afternoon sun, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough away to respect the invisible barriers that trauma built around people like armor made of air and desperation. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Serafina," the girl replied, and Luella heard in that single word all the music that had been beaten out of it by years of being told it didn't matter. "Serafina," Luella repeated, tasting the beauty of a name that belonged to someone worth saving. "That's a beautiful name. It means burning one. Did you know that?" The girl shook her head, tears leaving clean tracks through dirt that spoke of poverty and neglect in equal measure. "My name is Luella," she continued, "and 6 months ago, I was exactly where you are now. Convinced I was worthless, grateful for any attention that didn't come with fists attached, ready to believe that being sold was better than being unwanted." She pulled a business card from her purse, simple white cardstock with an address and phone number, no fancy logo or corporate promises, just information for people who needed help more than they needed hope wrapped in pretty packages. "This is a safe house," she explained. "Women who've escaped situations like ours, working together to make sure no one else has to trade their soul for the illusion of love. We can't give you a fairy tale, Serafina, but we can give you something better." "What's that?" "The chance to decide for yourself what beautiful means." That night, in a different boarding house in a different city, Luella helped Serafina wash the accumulated grime of neglect from her hair, while Evangeline made phone calls to lawyers who specialized in family court and social workers who understood that sometimes salvation required breaking laws written by people who'd never been sold like livestock. The music box from Darian's collection sat on the windowsill, but instead of playing funeral dirges for women who'd lost themselves, it now played a melody that Luella had learned to recognize as hope learning how to sing again. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Serafina asked as Luella braided her damp hair with fingers that had learned gentleness from surviving its absence. "I think," Luella said, watching their reflections in the darkened window, two women whose faces would never launch ships or inspire sonnets, but whose eyes held the quiet strength of people who'd refused to disappear, that the most beautiful thing about us was never our faces. What was it then? Luella smiled, and for the first time in her life, she liked what she saw in the mirror. Our refusal to let other people write the ending to our stories. Outside, the city hummed with the lives of 8 million people, most of whom would wake up tomorrow and forget that women like Serafina existed, forget that girls were still being sold in boarding houses and back alleys and family meetings where money mattered more than heartbeats. But some people would remember. Some people would care. And in safe houses and courtrooms, and the quiet spaces where truth was allowed to exist without decoration, the work would continue. Because the most beautiful revolution was the one that happened one saved life at a time, one woman at a time deciding that she was worth more than the price tag someone else had hung around her neck. And in Virginia, where an estate had burned to the ground and taken its secrets with it, roses still bloomed in soil that had been enriched by dreams that refused to stay buried. Some things, Luella had learned, were too beautiful to die, even when they'd never been beautiful to begin with.